So I have the authenticate method here, which checks whether the user ID and password have been authenticated or not, are valid or not. Now, what I need to do here is, from here, I need to call this method, because this is a controller. The controller will not be doing the work of the business service. The business service is entrusted with the responsibility of doing the authentication, and the controller just calls that method of the business service. So let me instantiate an object of the business service. Okay, I've created an object here, and now of course I'll have to import that class. And now all I need to do is pass the user ID and the password, these two strings here, to this, the method of this service object, and then capture the response. Now let me declare a boolean result equals login service dot authenticate. Now I will pass the user ID and the password. Eclipse has pre-filled it for us, so I'll just leave it at that. Now, depending on the value of the result, if it is true or if it is false, we will have to take action accordingly. Now, if the result is true, then we'll have to redirect to a success message page. And if the result is false, we will have to redirect to a login page, which we already did it. Now, let's pause for a minute and think this over. In our earlier examples, our do post would just get the request and get the response, and then use the request to get the input values and then write to the response object. We have never actually redirected from this piece of code to another servlet or another JSP. So far all our examples have been standalone servlets which just get the request and then deliver the response. So now we need to understand how to redirect control from this servlet to another JSP, be it the login JSP or the success message JSP. So before we learn how to redirect, let's create the success message JSP as well. So I'll again right click, new JSP file. I'll call this success.jsp, and I'll change the title here to success, and then I'll add some text here. Login successful, and I'll save this. Okay, so now we have both these JSPs, the login.jsp and the success.jsp ready. Now, how do we do the actual redirection? We do the redirection by using a method from the response object. The way it works is, if you have content that you need to send to the response object, then you use the response object and then you get a print writer and you print all those values into the response object. But in this case, we are not actually printing content to the response object. Instead, we will send an instruction to the response object saying, hey, I don't have the content here, but you should redirect to this other page which will display the content. So basically, instead of printing a text or HTML that gets sent to the response, we are actually sending instruction to do an actual redirection. So once we pass this response, Tomcat will again convert that to HTML code and send it to the user, so the user's browser knows, okay, this is not an actual response. I actually need to look up at another page, and then it does the request for the page that we will instruct in the response object. So let's pass the instruction depending on the result. Now, if result, which means that if it is successful. Now, if the login is successful, what do we need to do? We need to redirect to the success.jsp, which means we need to send an instruction to the browser saying redirect to success.jsp. Now, the way we do that is by using the response object, and we use a method called send redirect. Now, the send redirect takes one parameter which is actually the name of the new resource where you're actually redirecting the response. Now, the new resource in this case is success.jsp. So we'll just pass the JSP name here, success.jsp. And I will add something else here, which I'll explain in a little while. I'll just add a return. Okay. Now, if the result is false, that means that the authentication has failed. In that case, we will do a response.redirect again to the login.jsp, and I'll add a return here as well. Okay, let me save this, and let's run the login.jsp again. Okay, so I'll type some user ID and I'll type some password. I'll say submit query. There you go, it's gone to success.jsp. Now what happens if I leave the password as blank? Submit query, it's back to the login.jsp page. So I hope it's the flow is clear now. The login.jsp actually does the submit, and then the value that you've entered here goes to the action, which is a login. And the login is actually handled by the servlet because we have defined it over here. Now, since the method is post, the do post method of the servlet is called, and in this do post method we actually capture the parameters that are being passed, and we instantiate a login service, which is a business service. And in the business service method we have an authenticate, and we pass the user ID and password that has been sent to us to this authenticate method. Now the authenticate method takes over and it checks for just the password. Again, this is a dummy method. It just checks if the password is null or just blank, then it will return false. But if the password has some characters, then it returns true. Now once we get the response, we're storing it in the result boolean, and then now if the result is true, then we redirect to success.jsp, and if the result is false, then we redirect to login.jsp. So what have we implemented so far? We've implemented the controller, which is login servlet. We have implemented the business service, which is login service, and we have implemented the view, which is success.jsp and login.jsp. Now what's the model here? We are not passing a lot of data around. All we are passing is this boolean from the business service. So actually the model here happens to be the boolean, the result that we are getting here. Now we are not using the boolean in order to generate the view itself. We are using it to decide what happens to the view, whether we need to go to success or back to the login. But the success.jsp does not use this boolean result. So we'll make some changes to the code so that we actually get some data from the business service, and we will use that data inside our view, say from our success.jsp, in order to change how the view gets displayed. Overall, this is a basic layout of a MVC, where we have the model, which is the boolean as the end, V, which is the view, the success.jsp, and the login.jsp, and C, the controller, which is this login servlet. Now, before we wind up, there is one other thing we need to learn here. We saw this response.sendRedirect is the method that we use in order to send a response to a different page or a different resource. So the parameter that we take here is the actual URL here at success.jsp. In case it's a servlet, then we need to mention the servlet path that we define for the servlet. Say for example, I was in another servlet and I had to redirect to this login servlet. So this is the login path. So I will have to send login over here instead of the JSP name. So that's one point. The second point is that response.sendRedirect cannot be used with a actual response that is sent, using our previous method. What I mean by this is, let's say, for example, you use the response object and get a print writer. And once you start writing HTML content to the response object using that print writer, then somewhere in between, you cannot do a response.send redirect. It has to be either the HTML content or a redirect. So this is applicable both ways. Now, once you do a send redirect, you cannot use the response object to write any HTML and send it back to the user. Well, it of course doesn't make sense, because once you're doing a redirect, then the end user is going to get a redirect instruction on his browser, and then the browser is going to redirect to the URL that we're going to send here. So there is no point in doing a send redirect as well as sending text or HTML using the response object. So it has to be either one or the other. Okay, well, this application is far from perfect. There are a lot of changes that we can do, and the first change that we're going to do now is to take a value from the business service and then pass it on to the view, and then the view is going to use that value and render something different.